Everyone, Paige Abbott here. Today I'm going to talk about moving from being a people pleaser to not being a people pleaser. Stay tuned. I have to laugh at myself that I don't even know what the opposite of a people pleaser would be in a term. I guess it would be a healthy person with boundaries. So how do we move from being a people pleaser to being you? There you go. There's the opposite of a people pleaser, is just being yourself. First of all, to back up, what are some of the quintessential indicators that you may struggle with people pleasing? I think a big part of it is people who struggle with boundaries. So, do you have a difficult time saying no? Do you have difficulty speaking up for your preferences and needs? Do you have difficulty identifying what your needs are? Do you find yourself agreeing to things that you don't actually believe or don't want to do or don't have the capacity to do? These are all signs that you are morphing or adapting your behavior, even your personality to a certain extent. At least you're trying to adapt your personality to meet the needs of the situation. The people pleaser is under constant duress because they're constantly trying to figure out what the people around them need and then adapting their behavior, what they're saying, what they're doing, how they're acting and reacting to that. So just based on that, you can imagine how draining it is to be a people pleaser. And yet so many people get caught up in this cycle. That might lead to a next question that you have of how come? How come certain people are vulnerable to being caught in that people-pleasing cycle? Really, I think that's a complex answer to a question because there could be many different vulnerabilities that feed into that people-pleasing tendency. For some, it's growing up with attachment issues, so not feeling well connected to parents or guardians, caregivers when you're in your first kind of year or so of life. That might create some insecurity. If your parent or guardian wasn't really there in a consistent way for you, you may have adapted how you were acting and reacting, even as young as when you were an infant, to try and get your needs met. This may seem a bit unbelievable, but I think that we often undervalue how adaptive and how resilient we attempt to be as human beings, even as babies. And if our needs are not being met, we will adapt and continue to adapt until we find a way to get those needs met. Unfortunately, sometimes the adaptations that we make become maladaptive, so not helpful, even if initially they started off being helpful for us. So even an infant who maybe learned to not cry as often or as quickly if they were hungry or if they needed to be changed, that may be adaptive in that current environment because perhaps the parents are then less stressed and there isn't as much tension in the household. But long term, that adaptation becomes not helpful because now the person learns to disconnect from their own cues and has difficulty speaking up for their needs. So difficulties with people pleasing can go back as far as infancy based on what was happening in those early childhood experiences. It may also come from traumas, so people who've been hurt, abused, violated as they grew up, again, may have adapted to try and protect themselves by appeasing the people around them. Being that people pleaser may seem to reduce the immediacy of threat. Again, in certain environments or certain situations, that may actually be adaptive, but in other environments or relationships, it becomes harmful. People pleasing may also come out of addiction, codependency, Where do those issues come from? A lot of the same roots. So there's a genetic, biological root to addiction and codependency. So that's built into our DNA and genetic framework and can get activated by those early childhood experiences, by trauma, and also just by the environment that we're raised in. So what we learn from our peers, from teachers, from important people in our life and role models, how we interact. We bumble along in life basically looking for what reinforces us. So if we do something, for instance, maybe we agree with somebody's perspective that we don't actually agree with, but we do it just to do it, maybe out of peer pressure or to see how it'll go. And we find that we get some reinforcement by doing that. Maybe the person likes us more or gives us a special snack on the playground. They reinforce it somehow through their behavior, their words, anything that codes in our brain as that was good, must do it again. Now, these innocent behaviors that start off with some adaptive value and that often start off quite randomly, just something happens where we get that reinforcement that can be enough to take off even a long time of engaging in this behavior, because we continue to look for that same type of reinforcement as we keep engaging in that behavior. So that's what I was meaning, that it's a pretty complex thing. By the time that you're aware of this, usually there has been quite a bit of harm done from that people-pleasing behavior. It may even be to the extent that you don't know who you are and you've really disconnected from your own self. So how do we move away from people-pleasing? I think a lot of times people come back to the encouragement for boundaries, and that certainly is a huge part of people-pleasing. I would pull it back even a little bit further, because boundaries can be a pretty hard, pretty scary thing for the people pleaser. And let's face it, that to implement boundaries, you have to actually be aware of what your needs are, or else you're just going to be randomly shooting in the dark to figure out, what do my boundaries actually need to be? Boundaries are a way to uphold and meet our needs, but if we don't even know what our needs are, you see where I'm going with this. It becomes a little bit difficult to just move ahead with that implementation of boundaries. So to get to the place of identifying your needs to implement your boundaries, what I would say is a starting point is to start to understand who you are. And this can start at, honestly, the most basic and rudimentary of levels. I encourage people who are starting to recover from people pleasing to really start to challenge and experiment with their preferences. So buy different products, buy different brands of toilet paper, try different foods, use different hand soaps, do things that are fairly minimal investment. You're using them in your daily life anyways, but it starts to give you a sense of your preferences. So as you're trying that different brand of toilet paper or you're eating that different food, you then have to really check in with yourself on, what's that like for me? Do I like that brand? Do I prefer this other brand? Do I like the taste of this food? Do I like it in this certain combination but not with other things? Whatever the case is, there's no right or wrong with this. You're just starting to cultivate that connection with self. So you're building that relationship with yourself to start to know who you are and what your preferences are. If you start with the smaller things that are low investment, low risk, then that helps you to build up to the bigger things. So starting to know just on a daily level how you want to nourish yourself, how you want to take care of yourself, can then lead to, what do you want to do with your time? So you may want to start experimenting with different activities, try out different things with, again, hopefully minimal investment and risk, to just try them for the sake of trying them. So maybe you go to some different drop-in groups or activities, maybe you purchase some low-cost different supplies or games or puzzles, just to start trying them out to see, how does this go? Do I like it? Is this fun? These are the ways that we start to build that connection with self. That can then lead to the next level of emotional needs. And to do that, a lot of people will start to do some reflection, maybe some meditation, maybe some journaling, taking time regularly to check in on not just what's happening in your life, but how did it impact you? So when that colleague was frustrated with your performance earlier today, that happened, but what was that like for you? What were your feelings? How comfortable or uncomfortable were you? This starts to give you a sense of your inner world. Some people may start to do things like personality typing to start to identify their base personality preferences. I would not recommend doing this at the beginning of your healing from a people pleaser, because there's likely been so much adaptation and chameleoning, so changing your skin in so many different ways, that even when you're answering questions on a personality questionnaire, your brain is going to be bouncing all over the place trying to figure out, what is the test taker or the test maker? What are they looking for? What's the right answer? What's the best answer? Your brain is going to be a flurry of that people-pleasing activity, and that's going to interfere with the results. But as you're starting to feel that you're building a foundation of starting to know who you are, starting to acknowledge who you are, and maybe even starting to accept who you are, that's when you may start to bring in some of those tools. At this point, you may start to do some therapeutic work. Maybe you've already been doing that and talking with your counselor about your preferences, who you are, qualities that you identify that you have. Maybe you start getting some feedback from those around you about how they see you and what they see some of your core qualities to be. Maybe you start working on some affirmations to build up more reinforcement for the things that you like and view as strengths within yourself. And this all starts to lead up to being able to identify where boundaries may be needed in your world. So where are there parameters in relationships? What can you step into? What can you provide? What are you okay to say yes to? And what do you need to start saying no to or pulling back from? And this will be activity-wise, this will be work-wise, this will be relational-wise. So different commitments that have come your way that the people pleaser has a difficult time saying no to, you can start to look at, ideally with some support. So that's where a therapeutic group or a therapist can really be helpful to keep you active in identifying where that people-pleasing vulnerability wants to come forward and holding yourself accountable with that additional support to these newer boundaries that you're working to implement. I'm not going to lie, it's not an easy journey. I would say I'm a people pleaser in recovery myself. And again, that comes out of some complex roots that I can't just pinpoint one thing that led me to some of those people pleasing traits. But I've also worked damned hard, and I hope you will as well, to really connect with that sense of self. I'm grateful. I don't feel I fully ever lost that sense of self so completely, but definitely know that in certain environments and with certain types of people, it's harder to speak up. It's harder to voice my opinion, my perspective, to say no or decline something. And so that's led to some evaluation of the people in my life, the things that I do, to see, is it possible to engage with these activities and these people and still retain my authentic core sense of self? Or do some changes need to be made there? So your environment matters a lot in your recovery from people pleasing, as does the other things that you're doing to take care of yourself. So obviously continuing to engage in behaviors like substance use or gambling or behaviors that further numb you and take you away from yourself makes it even harder to connect and really get to know and appreciate that authentic self. So there may be some additional pieces of addiction or mental health recovery work that need to be brought in to this journey of recovering from people pleasing. Look at how the time flies. I could talk about this all day because I do. This is a huge part of the work that I do. As many of you know who are my clients, and as many of you who are getting to know me just in the online world are starting to appreciate that discovery of that authentic self and really advocating for that in your world is a huge part of mental health and recovery. Thanks so much for spending this time with me and going through this journey of recovery from people pleasing. I wish you all the best in your journey moving forward. And if you have any further questions about this topic or other topics, I'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to comment below. Bye for now.